Leadership isn't claimed in a ceremony. It's proven in the silence that follows, when the ones who doubted finally understand what they're looking at. The morning fog hung low over Naval Air Station Oceana, thick as wet wool, muffling the distant thunder of FA-18s conducting dawn exercises somewhere beyond the gray. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the parking lot, her sea bag over one shoulder, watching the mist curl between the hangars like something alive and uncertain. She'd arrived early, she always arrived early. 22 years in the Navy had taught her that the first impressions you made were often the ones that mattered most, and today's first impression would set the tone for everything that followed. The Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic headquarters building rose before her, a squat structure of concrete and glass that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling near the roofline. The flagpole out front needed attention. Small things, but telling things. A command reflected its leadership, and the leadership she was replacing had let certain standards slip. That was about to change. Sarah checked her uniform one final time, running her fingers along the crisp edges of her service dress blues, feeling the weight of the silver oak leaves on her collar. 18 months ago, she'd been flying combat missions over the South China Sea, pushing her Super Hornet through maneuvers that would have made her instructors wince. Now she was here, about to take command of the administrative heart of the Navy's East Coast strike fighter community. Some would call it a step down. She called it a different kind of mission. She crossed the parking lot and pushed through the main entrance, stepping into a lobby that smelled of old coffee and bureaucratic inertia. The petty officer at the front desk was young, maybe 23, with the slightly glazed expression of someone who'd drawn the early watch and was counting the minutes until relief. He glanced up as she approached, his eyes moving over her uniform with the automatic assessment of enlisted personnel everywhere. Female officer, commander's rank, unfamiliar face. His brain processed these data points and reached a conclusion that Sarah had encountered many times before. "Ma'am, I think you might be in the wrong building." His tone was helpful, almost kind. "Personnel offices are in Building 7 across the compound. This is wing headquarters." Sarah let the moment stretch, watching the young man's face. He wasn't being malicious. He was simply operating on assumptions built from years of experience in a world where women in her position were still rare enough to be surprising. "I know where I am, Petty Officer." "Morrison, ma'am." "Petty Officer Morrison." She reached into her pocket and withdrew her orders, the crisp Navy stationery bearing the official seal of the Bureau of Naval Personnel. "I'm Commander Sarah Chen. I'm here to assume command of Strike Fighter Wing, Atlantic." Morrison's expression underwent a transformation that Sarah had witnessed dozens of times throughout her career, the rapid recalibration of someone whose assumptions had just collided with reality. His eyes widened, color rose in his cheeks. His posture shifted from casual helpfulness to something approaching attention. "Commander Chen, ma'am, I'm sorry, I didn't realize—" "It's fine, Petty Officer. Where's Captain Hendricks? I'm expected for turnover at 0800. "The Commodore's in his office, ma'am. Second deck, end of the passageway. I can escort you." "I'll find it." Sarah tucked her orders back into her pocket and headed for the stairs, feeling Morrison's eyes on her back. She could imagine what he was thinking, the mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. The questions he'd ask his shipmates later. "Did you see who showed up this morning? The new wing commander?" "Yeah, a woman. I didn't believe it either." Let them wonder. Let them talk. Words were cheap. What mattered was what came next. Commodore James Hendricks was a large man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years squinting into the sun on carrier flight decks. He rose as Sarah entered his office, extending a hand that enveloped hers like a catcher's mitt. "Commander Chen, welcome aboard." His voice carried the gravelly warmth of a career aviator. "I've heard good things. Your squadron in Japan set records for sortie generation rates. We had good people, sir." "That's what good COs always say." Hendricks gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit. We've got a lot to cover before the change of command ceremony." The next 2 hours were a deep dive into the world Sarah was inheriting. Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic was the administrative umbrella for 9 squadrons, nearly 200 aircraft, and over 3,000 personnel scattered across multiple air stations. The wing commander's job was to ensure that this sprawling organization ran smoothly, that pilots were trained and qualified, that aircraft were maintained and mission-ready, that the countless administrative functions supporting naval aviation functioned without interruption. On paper, it was a desk job. In reality, it was a crucible of competing demands, limited resources, and the constant pressure of preparing young aviators for a world where mistakes cost lives. "Your predecessor," Hendricks said carefully, "was a good man, but he was tired. The last 18 months showed it. Training completion rates have slipped. Maintenance backlogs have grown. There's been some cultural drift. Cultural drift, sir? Hendricks leaned back in his chair, his expression somewhere between resignation and hope. The squadrons have gotten comfortable. Standards have relaxed. The kind of thing that doesn't show up in reports but you feel in the passageways. The edge is dulled. Sarah understood. She'd seen it before, in units where leadership had become more about managing than commanding. The slow erosion of discipline that came when people stopped being pushed, when excellence became optional rather than expected. I'll address it, sir. I know you will. That's why you're here. Hendricks stood and walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where maintenance crews were swarming over aircraft in the weak morning light. You should know that not everyone is happy about this assignment. Some of the squadron COs, they had expectations. They thought one of their own would get the nod. I'm aware, sir. Good. Then you know what you're walking into. He turned back to face her. I won't sugarcoat it, Commander. You're going to face resistance. Some of it will be professional disagreement. Some of it will be other things. Things that shouldn't matter but do. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I've been facing those things my whole career, Commodore. I know what I'm dealing with. I believe you do. Hendricks nodded slowly. The change of command ceremony is at 1400. Until then, I'd recommend you walk the spaces. Get a feel for what you're inheriting. Let people see you. That was my plan, sir. Sarah spent the next 4 hours doing exactly what Hendricks had suggested. She walked through maintenance hangars where aircraft sat in various states of repair, their innards exposed like patients on operating tables. She visited administrative offices where sailors processed the endless paperwork that kept a military organization functioning. She stopped by the training department, the safety office, the operations center. Everywhere she went, she saw the same pattern. Initial surprise when people realized who she was. The quick recalibration of assumptions, the careful professional courtesy that masked deeper uncertainty. She didn't push, not yet. She asked questions, listened to answers, filed away information for later use. First impressions mattered, but lasting impressions were built over time. In the maintenance hangar for VFA 106, the fleet replacement squadron responsible for training new FA-18 pilots, she found what she was looking for. Or, rather, what she'd hoped not to find. Master Chief Aviation Maintenance Technician Robert Drake was a legend in the naval aviation community, a man who'd spent 31 years keeping fighters in the air through skill, determination, and what some called magic. He stood before an aircraft with its engine access panels removed, surrounded by a cluster of young sailors, gesturing at something deep in the mechanical complexity. Sarah approached quietly, staying at the edge of the group, listening. Drake's voice carried the rough authority of someone who'd earned his position through decades of excellence. You see this fitting here? This is what killed Lieutenant Commander Morrison in 1998. Maintenance manual said check it every 100 hours. We check it every 50. Because the manual doesn't know what combat stress does to this system, but I do. Questions? The young sailors shook their heads, absorbing the lesson with the serious attention of people who understood that the knowledge being shared could someday save lives. Drake dismissed them and turned, his eyes finding Sarah. Something flickered across his weathered face. Not quite surprise, more like the settling of an expectation. Commander Chen. His voice was neutral, professionally correct. Heard you were coming aboard. Master Chief Drake, your reputation precedes you. Does it? It wasn't a question. Drake wiped his hands on a rag that looked like it had been used for the same purpose since the Reagan administration. You flew Hornets in the Pacific, didn't you? VFA 27, then the CAG staff. That's right. I remember your name from the maintenance reports. Your squadron had good numbers, clean jets, high readiness rates. He paused, something shifting in his expression. Most pilots don't pay attention to those things. They just want their aircraft to work. They don't care how it happens. I care because my life depended on people like you doing your jobs right. Every time I strapped in, I was betting everything on the assumption that the maintenance was done correctly. That's not a bet you take lightly. Drake studied her for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it, or at least find enough of it to continue the conversation. The squadrons here, they've gotten soft. Not the maintainers so much, but the culture, the officers. He glanced around, lowering his voice slightly. Your predecessor was a good man, but he didn't understand aircraft. He was a P3 guy, sub-hunters, different world. He let the squadron COs run things their own way, and some of those ways weren't right. What kinds of things? Training shortcuts, maintenance deferments that shouldn't have been approved, the kind of compromises that seem reasonable until someone dies. Drake's jaw tightened. "We had a Class A mishap 6 months ago. Pilot ejected safely, but the aircraft was totaled. The investigation blamed pilot error, but I read the maintenance logs. There were signs we should have caught, signs we would have caught 5 years ago." Sarah absorbed this, adding it to the picture she was building. "What would you recommend, Master Chief?" The question seemed to surprise him. His eyes narrowed slightly as if testing whether she was serious. "I'd recommend getting the squadron COs together and reminding them what standards mean. I'd recommend walking the maintenance spaces more than your predecessor did. I'd recommend listening to the people who actually keep these jets flying instead of just reading reports." That sounds like a solid plan. It sounds like common sense, but common sense isn't as common as the name suggests. Sarah allowed herself a slight smile. "No, it isn't. Thank you for your candor, Master Chief. I have a feeling we'll be talking again." She walked away feeling Drake's eyes on her back. She could sense the assessment happening, the weighing of evidence against expectation. She'd passed some preliminary test, earned some provisional measure of respect. But it was provisional. Everything was provisional until proven otherwise. The change of command ceremony took place on the flight line, with an FA-18E Super Hornet as the backdrop and the assembled personnel of Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic arrayed in formation. The Virginia sun had burned off the morning fog, leaving a sky of brilliant blue that seemed designed to showcase the aircraft gleaming in their gray paint. Sarah stood at attention as Commodore Hendricks read the orders, as the official authority passed from one commander to the next. She watched the faces of the squadron commanders in the front row, reading the subtle variations in their expressions. Professional acceptance from some, calculated neutrality from others, and from a few, the barely concealed skepticism of men who'd spent their careers in a world where women like her were anomalies rather than the norm. Captain Eric Lawson, commanding officer of VFA 106, stood at the far end of the front row, with his arms crossed over his chest. He was 44 years old, a combat veteran with 2 distinguished flying crosses and a reputation for speaking his mind regardless of consequences. His expression said more than words could have. Sarah filed it away. Another data point, another challenge to address. When the ceremony ended and the formations dispersed, she made her way through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, beginning the process of building relationships that would define her command. It was exhausting work, the constant performance of confidence and competence, but it was necessary work. Commander Michael Torres, CO of VFA 131, found her near the refreshment table. He was shorter than most aviators, compact and intense, with eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." His tone was carefully neutral. "Quite a ceremony." "It was. I'm looking forward to working with you, Commander." "Likewise." Torres paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I should tell you, there's been some discussion among the squadron COs about your assignment. I'd be surprised if there hadn't been. Some of us think it's long overdue. Others," he shrugged, "others have concerns, not about you personally, about whether someone from outside the community can understand what we need." Sarah considered her response carefully. "I spent 8 years flying the same aircraft your squadrons operate. I've been in combat. I've trained junior pilots. I've dealt with the same maintenance challenges and personnel issues you deal with. I may not have commanded a strike fighter squadron, but I know this community." That's what I told them. Torres's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you'll do fine. But you should know that Lawson and a few others, they're going to test you. It's not personal. It's just how they are." "I appreciate the warning, Commander." "It's not a warning. It's information." He paused. "Welcome to the wing, ma'am. I hope you prove them wrong." The first week was a blur of meetings, briefings, and the endless administrative tasks that came with assuming command of a major military organization. Sarah worked 18-hour days, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, immersing herself in the details of her new command. She reviewed training records and maintenance logs. She studied readiness reports and personnel evaluations. She met individually with each squadron commander, listening to their concerns, their challenges, their ideas for improvement. She asked questions and took notes and began building a comprehensive picture of what was working and what wasn't. Most of all, she watched. She watched how people interacted, how decisions were made, how information flowed or didn't flow through the organization. She watched for the subtle signs of dysfunction that wouldn't appear in any official report, but shaped the culture of the command. What she found troubled her. The maintenance statistics were adequate, but not excellent. Training completion rates had slipped below fleet averages. There had been 3 safety incidents in the past 6 months, none catastrophic, but all preventable. The squadrons were operating as independent fiefdoms rather than coordinated elements of a larger whole. And underneath it all, she sensed something else, a complacency that had settled over the command like a fine dust, invisible until you looked closely, but present in everything. The edge that Hendricks had mentioned wasn't just dulled. In some places, it had disappeared entirely. On her 8th day in command, Sarah convened a meeting of all squadron commanding officers in the main conference room. The 7 men arranged themselves around the long table, coffee cups in hand, expressions ranging from curiosity to carefully concealed irritation. Captain Lawson sat at the far end, his posture radiating skepticism. He'd been conspicuously absent from the informal gatherings that had marked Sarah's first week, and his squadron had been slow to respond to her requests for information. Small acts of resistance, petty but pointed. Sarah stood at the head of the table, her notes spread before her, and began without preamble. I've spent the past week reviewing every aspect of this command. Training records, maintenance logs, safety reports, readiness statistics. I've talked to department heads, maintenance chiefs, and junior officers. I've walked every space and visited every squadron. She paused, letting the silence settle. What I've found is unacceptable. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. She saw the ripple of reaction move around the table, saw backs stiffen and expressions harden. Our training completion rate is 12% below fleet average. We've had 3 Class C safety incidents in 6 months, all attributed to procedures that weren't followed. Our aircraft availability rate is adequate, but we're deferring maintenance that shouldn't be deferred, and the coordination between squadrons is essentially non-existent. Lawson leaned back in his chair. With respect, ma'am, I'm not sure a week of observation qualifies you to make those assessments. Some of us have been here for years. That's precisely the problem, Captain. Sarah met his gaze directly. You've been here so long, you've stopped seeing what's in front of you. Standards have slipped, and no one noticed because the slippage was gradual. A small compromise here, a minor shortcut there. None of it catastrophic by itself, but taken together. We've maintained readiness, another CO interjected. We've met every deployment requirement. Barely, and meeting minimum requirements isn't the same as excellence. We're supposed to be the best strike fighter wing in the Navy. Right now, we're average at best. The room fell silent. Sarah could feel the resistance, the defensive walls going up, the instinctive rejection of criticism from an outsider. She'd expected it. She'd prepared for it. She reached into her folder and withdrew a stack of photographs, spreading them across the table. They showed aircraft components, maintenance records, training scenarios. These are examples of what I'm talking about. This fitting, she pointed to one photo, should have been replaced 2 months ago according to the maintenance schedule. It's still in service because someone decided the deferral was acceptable. This training scenario, another photo, hasn't been conducted in 8 months because it's difficult and time-consuming. This coordination procedure between squadrons, a document, exists on paper but hasn't been practiced in a year. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each commander in turn. I'm not here to assign blame. What's done is done. I'm here to fix it, and I'm going to need your help. But let me be clear about one thing. The era of comfortable mediocrity is over. We're going to return to the standards this wing was built on, and we're going to do it together. Anyone who isn't willing to be part of that solution needs to let me know now. The silence stretched. Sarah watched the faces around the table, reading the calculations happening behind each pair of eyes. Some were reconsidering their initial assessments. Others were digging in deeper. And Lawson? Lawson was looking at her with something that might have been the first glimmer of respect or might have been the hardening of opposition. Commander Torres spoke first. What do you need from us, ma'am? I need you to trust me. I know that's a lot to ask right now from someone you don't know. But I've been where you are. I've commanded aviators, I've flown combat missions, I've dealt with the same pressures you deal with. I'm not some desk officer who doesn't understand operations. I'm a pilot who's been given a different kind of mission. She paused, letting her words settle. I'm not going to micromanage your squadrons. You know your people better than I do. But I am going to hold you accountable for results. We're going to establish clear standards, and we're going to meet them. Not because I said so, but because that's what the sailors and Marines who fly these aircraft deserve. They deserve leaders who demand excellence, not leaders who accept adequacy. The meeting lasted another 2 hours as they worked through specific issues, established priorities, and began building the framework for improvement. It wasn't easy. There was pushback, disagreement, the inevitable friction of strong personalities working through difficult problems. But by the end, something had shifted. Not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of engagement. After the others had filed out, Lawson lingered by the door. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak, then turned to face her. "You know, when I heard a woman was taking over the wing, I thought it was a political appointment, checking a box. The kind of thing that looks good in press releases but doesn't help anyone." Sarah said nothing, waiting. "I've been in naval aviation for 23 years. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not. I've seen officers promoted because they looked good rather than because they were good. I've seen programs designed to change demographics rather than improve readiness." He paused. "So, when you showed up, I was prepared to see more of the same. And now," Lawson's jaw worked for a moment, "now, I'm not sure. You know the aircraft, you know the community. The things you identified in that meeting, they're real problems. Problems some of us have been ignoring because fixing them is hard." "That's not quite an endorsement, Captain." "No, it's not, but it's not a rejection either." He met her eyes. "I'm willing to give you a chance to prove me wrong. That's more than I expected to say when I walked in here." "I'll take it." He nodded once and left, leaving Sarah alone in the conference room with the weight of what she'd started. The months that followed were a relentless grind of improvement. Sarah worked with each squadron individually, identifying weaknesses and developing solutions. She implemented new coordination procedures, established regular cross-training exercises, and created accountability systems that tracked progress against specific metrics. She spent time in maintenance spaces, learning the names of chiefs and technicians, understanding the practical challenges they faced. She flew with the squadrons whenever regulations permitted, demonstrating that her authority wasn't just administrative, but was rooted in the same skills she was asking others to develop. Not everyone was convinced. Lawson remained skeptical, though his skepticism had evolved from outright opposition to watchful reservation. Other officers who'd expected a weak or symbolic leadership found their assumptions challenged by the reality of a commander who knew her business and wasn't afraid to demand results. But change was happening. Training completion rates climbed, maintenance backlogs shrank. The safety incidents that had plagued the wing in the previous year dropped to zero, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture began to shift. It came to a head 6 months into her command, during a major training exercise off the Virginia coast. The scenario was complex, a simulated strike against defended targets that required coordination between multiple squadrons, precise timing, and the kind of decision-making under pressure that separated competent aviators from exceptional ones. Sarah had designed the exercise herself, working with her staff to create the most realistic possible test of everything they'd been working to improve. What she hadn't anticipated was that the exercise would coincide with a real-world crisis. The call came at 300 on the second day of the exercise. A cargo ship carrying American civilians had been seized by pirates off the coast of Africa. The Navy was surging assets to the region, and Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic was being tasked to provide immediate support for a potential rescue operation. Sarah was in the operations center within minutes, surrounded by her staff, absorbing the rapid flow of information. The situation was evolving quickly. Intelligence suggested the pirates were connected to a larger terrorist network. The civilians, the families of diplomatic personnel, were in immediate danger. "We need 4 squadrons ready to deploy within 48 hours, the message from Fleet Forces Command stated. "Full combat capability. This isn't a training deployment." 48 hours. It would have been impossible 6 months ago. The squadrons weren't ready. The maintenance schedules were too far behind. The coordination procedures weren't in place. They would have scrambled, improvised, somehow made it work. But it would have been ugly. Now Sarah looked around the operations center at the faces of her staff, at the screens showing aircraft status and personnel readiness, at the calm efficiency of a command that had been preparing for exactly this moment. "Start the recall," she said. "All hands. I want squadron COs in this room in 30 minutes. The next 2 days were controlled chaos. Aircraft were inspected, armed, and prepared for combat. Pilots reviewed intelligence, studied target packages, and ran through scenarios. Support personnel worked around the clock to ensure that everything the squadrons needed would be ready when they were. Sarah was everywhere, moving from squadron to squadron, coordinating with higher headquarters, making the 1,000 decisions that would determine whether the wing was ready to fight. She slept in 3-hour increments, ate when she remembered, and pushed through the exhaustion with the same determination she'd shown in combat. On the morning of the deployment, she stood on the flight line as the first aircraft taxied toward the runway. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the roar of engines filled the air with the sound of power barely contained. Lawson found her there, watching the jets queue up for launch. He stood beside her in silence for a moment, then spoke. "We're ready. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. 6 months ago, we wouldn't have been. You know that. I know. The coordination between squadrons, the maintenance readiness, the training, it's where it should be, where it should have been all along. That's not my accomplishment, Captain. It's yours. All of you. I just pointed out what needed to be done. Lawson shook his head. Don't do that. Don't minimize what you've done. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a commander who pushes paper and a commander who pushes people to be better. You pushed. The first aircraft roared down the runway, afterburners glowing in the early morning light. Then the second, and the third, and the fourth. One after another, they climbed into the sky, forming up in the distance, heading toward whatever waited for them on the other side of the world. Sarah watched until the last aircraft disappeared into the haze. Then she turned to find Master Chief Drake standing nearby, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. All jets up, he reported. No maintenance issues, every aircraft combat ready. Thank you, Master Chief. Don't thank me, thank the maintainers who worked through the night. Thank the leadership that gave them the resources and the expectations to do it right. He paused. Thank yourself, Commander. You did this. The deployment lasted 3 months. The rescue operation was successful. All the hostages recovered, no American casualties. The squadrons performed brilliantly, executing complex missions with precision and coordination that drew praise from commanders throughout the theater. Sarah followed every report, tracked every mission, and shared in every success and every setback from her position back at Oceana. It was the hardest part of command, watching from a distance as others faced the dangers she'd trained them to face. But it was also the purest expression of what leadership meant, preparing people to succeed when you weren't there to guide them. When the squadrons returned, Sarah was on the flight line to meet them. She shook hands and offered congratulations and listened to the stories of missions flown and challenges overcome. She saw the change in how people looked at her, the respect that had replaced skepticism, the trust that had grown from shared purpose and proven results. Later that evening, there was a gathering in the officers' club, an informal celebration of the deployment's success. Sarah moved through the crowd, accepting the congratulations that came her way, but her attention was drawn to a group of junior officers in the corner. They were young, most of them, lieutenants and lieutenant commanders with careers still ahead of them. And among them were 3 women, pilots who'd flown combat missions alongside their male colleagues, who'd earned their place in this community through skill and determination, and the same stubborn refusal to accept limits that had defined Sarah's own career. One of them caught her eye and raised a glass in silent tribute. Sarah returned the gesture, feeling something shift in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol and everything to do with what that moment represented. This was why it mattered, not the statistics or the readiness rates or the successful deployments. This, the knowledge that every door she'd opened, every barrier she'd pushed through, every moment of doubt she'd faced and overcome, it all created space for those who came after. The road she'd traveled had been hard. The doubts she'd faced from others and from herself had been real and constant. But standing here now, watching these young pilots who would never know how difficult their path had been made easier by those who went before, she understood that the struggle had been worth it. Captain Lawson appeared at her elbow, 2 glasses of bourbon in hand. He offered one to her, and she took it. Hell of a deployment, he said. Hell of a team. He was quiet for a moment, watching the same group of young officers she'd been observing. I was wrong about you, he said finally. When you first showed up, I thought you didn't belong here. I thought you were a diversity hire, a political appointment, someone who'd gotten the job because of what she was rather than what she could do. And now I know better. He turned to face her, his expression serious. You're the best wing commander I've served under, not the best female commander, not the best diversity success story. The best, period. Sarah felt the words land, felt their weight. That means a lot coming from you. It should. I don't say things like that often. He raised his glass. To Commander Chen, the woman who walked into the wrong building and turned out to be exactly where she belonged. They drank together, and the night went on around them, and somewhere in the celebration of a successful deployment, something else was being celebrated too. Something harder to name, but no less real. The quiet triumph of proving that doubt was just the first obstacle, not the last. That competence could overcome prejudice. That leadership was about what you did, not what you looked like doing it. Sarah Chen served as commander of Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic for 3 years. Under her leadership, the wing became the most decorated in naval aviation, winning multiple awards for excellence in training, maintenance, and operational readiness. The culture she built, the standards she established, became models for other commands throughout the fleet. But the achievement she valued, most couldn't be measured in awards or statistics. It was counted in the careers she'd shaped, the doors she'd opened, the pilots who'd gone on to command squadrons and air wings, and eventually commands of their own. Some of them were women who'd looked at her and seen what was possible. Most of them were men who'd learned that excellence had no gender. On her last day in command, Sarah walked through the spaces one final time. She visited the maintenance hangars, where jets sat ready for whatever mission might come. She stopped by the operations center where her staff was already planning the next exercise, the next deployment, the next challenge. She paused at the memorial wall in the headquarters building, looking at the photographs of aviators who'd given everything in service to their country. Master Chief Drake found her there, as she'd somehow known he would. "They'll miss you," he said simply. "They'll be fine, I've seen to that." "Yes, you have." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, pressing it into her hand. It was a challenge coin, worn smooth by years of handling, bearing the insignia of Strike Fighter Wing Atlantic. "The maintainers wanted you to have this. It's from the 2019 deployment, before you arrived. We've been passing it around ever since, giving it to people who earned it." He paused. "You earned it, Commander, more than anyone I've known." Sarah looked at the coin, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. "Thank you, Master Chief, for everything. Thank yourself, ma'am. You did the work." She left the building for the last time, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the flight line. In the distance, she could hear the thunder of engines as the next generation of pilots prepared for their next mission. The cycle continued, the work went on, and somewhere, in a briefing room or an operations center or a ready room, another woman was facing the same doubts Sarah had faced, hearing the same questions, fighting the same battles. The details would be different. The outcome would be the same. Because that was the lesson Sarah Chen had learned and passed on, the truth she'd proven again and again throughout her career. Competence was its own answer. Excellence was its own argument. And the best response to "you don't belong here" was simply to stay, and to excel, and to make it impossible for anyone to imagine the place without you. She climbed into her car and drove through the main gate, leaving behind the command she'd transformed and the people she'd led. In her pocket, the challenge coin pressed against her hip, a reminder of what she'd accomplished and what remained to be done. History doesn't remember every act of quiet courage, every battle fought in conference rooms and on flight lines, every moment when someone refused to accept the limits others tried to impose. But maybe it should. Maybe that's what stories are for. To remember the ones who walked into buildings where they weren't expected and proved they belonged. To honor those who answered doubt with determination, prejudice with performance, skepticism with excellence. To pass on the truth that leadership isn't found in the title you hold or the uniform you wear, but in the silence that follows when the ones who doubted finally understand. Commander Sarah Chen never called herself a pioneer, but every pilot she trained, every officer she mentored, every young woman who looked at her career and saw what was possible, they all tell the story. Because courage like that doesn't fade. It echoes forward from one generation to the next until the doors that were once closed are open so wide that no one remembers they were ever shut. Until "you're in the wrong building" becomes "welcome home." Until the only question left is not whether you belong, but how many others you can bring with you. That's the real victory. That's the legacy that matters. And it begins, as it always has, with someone who refuses to leave. For all those who walked into rooms where they weren't expected and stayed until expectations changed, your courage echoes still.